just moving on quickly, I reflect on how after about a decade of working in Yugoslavia and Rwanda and these sites of sorrow, I paid a very heavy price in terms of my family life. The birth of my child was this sort of epiphany when you see the miracle of life, and I decided I'm going to quit the UN. I said, I've had enough. I've paid my dues. I'm going to go and become a corporate lawyer in New York. So off I went to New York, and maybe I'll read for you just a couple of other bits, and then I'll stop there. So here is my short-lived career as a corporate lawyer in Manhattan. All circuits are busy. Please try your call again. On any other day, that would have been an annoying message made worse by the cordial voice of that anonymous woman who taunts irritated callers around the world with a mocking tone of polite ridicule. One of the fundamental rites of passage in modern society is to suffer the on-hold hell of automated telephone systems. Condescending recordings telling us that the next available customer service agent will be with us shortly, while for nearly an hour we listen to a never-ending loop of Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers singing Islands in the Stream. But on that day, instead of exasperation, the impersonal telephone rebuff gave rise to panic and desperation. All circuits are busy. I listened to the recording repeatedly as I obsessively dialed her number again and again. I was in utter disbelief at what had just happened. I was frantic to hear the voice of my wife and 2-year-old son, so that the nightmare of uncertainty would end. I just wanted to know that they were still alive. I thought of the joyous day he was born. His wondrous eyes were wide open, brimming with curiosity about the new world he had just entered. He'd grown so quickly. He was now an adorable toddler waddling around the house in pursuit of mischief, skillfully deploying his disarming smile with malice aforethought to undermine my fatherly authority. Shortly after I'd kissed him goodbye that morning on my way to work, he had taken the train to Manhattan with his mother and grandparents. They were on their way to the World Trade Center, and now their whereabouts were unknown. The date was September 11, 2001, the dawn of a new millennium. So it was remarkable to say that I'm going to leave all those war zones because I've had enough of extremism and violence and hatred. And then on September 11th, for several hours, having to wonder whether my own family was dead or alive. And those were the longest few hours I've ever had, except this time it wasn't someone else's family in Bosnia or Rwanda. I couldn't just feel sorry for them, get in a UN airlift, and go about my own life. And it was incredible having seen suffering, mass suffering around the world, to see it in New York and to see how people in this place of blind ambition all of a sudden had to deal with the randomness of life and death. Next door neighbor, 8-month pregnant woman whose husband happened to have a meeting in the World Trade Center that day and he died. Someone else whose husband worked there was in another building and survived, and the randomness of life and death. But I reflect on how the clash of civilizations, which became the narrative, completely missed the point. For me, the point of September 11th was the inextricable oneness of humankind. The inescapable fact that if we ignore the suffering of others in an inextricably interdependent world, it will come back to haunt us. Something called bad karma. It's my new international relations theory. So why do I say this? Because on September 10, I was reading a beautiful essay written by my friend Mohsen Nakhmalbaf, very famous Iranian filmmaker. You may have seen the film Kandahar, which in the style of cinema verite was made with Afghan refugees. He doesn't use professional actors, so he had gone and made a film about Afghanistan with Afghan refugees. And he told me that at a film festival, someone had come up to him and says, "What is Afghanistan?" Not where, but what is Afghanistan? And he was angry because in March of 2001, when the twin Buddhas of the Bamiyan were destroyed, there was public outrage but there was no outrage about the mass starvation and mass murder of people in Afghanistan, which was a country that was a pawn during the Cold War, where just as the Soviets invaded, the West, together with the Saudi Arabians and the Pakistanis, opened the jihadist sort of a bottle. The jihadist genie was released out of the bottle, and it was used as a weapon against the Soviet Union, very successfully, except that once the Soviets withdrew in 1989, we had no more use for Afghanistan. So it was sort of like, let's wash our hands clean and leave this cauldron of traumatized, young, jihadist, well-armed warriors that we ourselves trained, and let's just hope for the best. So it is blindingly obvious that 9/11 was only a matter of time. That it was only a matter of time before these currents of extremism and violence and hatred came to our own shores. So Makhmalbaf had written an essay called The Limbs of No Body, or the limbs that have been cut off from the body of humankind, because there is a poem which comes from Saadi, from Shiraz, and I will just read this very briefly for you, which is on a carpet which hangs at the portal of the UN General Assembly in New York. We Persians love carpets. So this one has a poem, and this is what the great statesmen of the world, as they enter the UN General Assembly, read. Human beings are members of a whole, in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. So Makhmalbaf was so upset at the world's indifference to the suffering of Afghanistan, and he said it's almost as if they're a limb that has been cut off because no one feels their pain. And he said the Buddhas were not demolished. They crumbled out of shame that their greatness could do no good. And on September 11th, as I saw the horror unfolding, I thought about this poem at the portal of the UN General Assembly. I thought about how our indifference to the suffering of others had come back to blow up in our face. And that's what I thought last summer when I sat face to face with a teenage suicide bomber from Syria in northern Iraq in a prison in Duhok. Obviously an unsuccessful suicide bomber. Otherwise I wouldn't be speaking with him. And I thought he was going to be some monster. He was a baby-faced teenage boy who begins this whole lecture of, there is only one Allah, we will destroy the enemies of Islam, and whatever his mind had been poisoned with by the recruiters of the caliphate that were using the desperation and narcissistic rage of these poor, traumatized young men. And at the end of the discussion, when we were about to say goodbye, he turns around to me and says, I miss my mother. I wish I could go to school and become a doctor. I wanted to become a doctor. So in the very final chapter, I asked the question of what had made, his name was Ahmed the healer, Ahmed the killer. Why would a young man who was intelligent, who had ambitions, who had dreams, become a suicide bomber? And what is the difference between him and some young boy I would meet in a shopping mall here, texting his girlfriend on his latest iPhone, for whom the suffering in Syria and Iraq would just be a Facebook post? And is it not the case that whether we're in the prison or the shopping mall, there's no escape from asking the perennial question of what it means to live and to die in a world of extremes? I reflect on this at the very end because I wanted to bring all of these stories back to the choices that we make right here in Canada as Canadians. Because I don't want to create the impression that to do good in the world, you need to be the Indiana Jones of the human rights world, going out there and fighting the windmills like Don Quixote in Bosnia and Rwanda and whatever the case may be. So I reflect on how our relation to suffering is a mirror of our soul, which reflects who we are as opposed to who we pretend to be. So that same summer, as I met these poor Yazidi girls, teenage girls, that had been reduced to sex slaves by ISIS and had somehow managed to escape, and sitting in this sweltering heat of a refugee camp. It was 50 degrees Celsius in Baghdad that summer. And you sit there in the filth and the stench and the trauma and the horrors. And then I come back to Ottawa, and in the House of Commons there's a debate which is a symbolic condemnation of the ISIS crimes. And it turns out to be a mud-throwing contest between the government and the opposition, with each side accusing the other of not feeling sorry enough for the victims while assuming a position of virtue. Sort of like the oppression Olympics. Let's see who feels more sorry for these victims, but let's not ask whether we can actually do something that's meaningful. And let's not ask what were the chain of cynical decisions that were made, which gave rise to teenagers like Ahmed deciding that death is better than life. During this debate, one parliamentarian, one very courageous woman, stands up and says, yes, ISIS chops off people's heads, and that's barbaric and it should be condemned. But Saudi Arabia also chops off people's heads, but we're selling billions of dollars of weapons to them. I fail to understand. There's a long silence. All of a sudden, the government and opposition find common cause. Because in politics, principles are sold to the highest bidder. It's wonderful to condemn barbarity as long as there's not a price tag attached. So we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised. Once you begin to connect the dots, you realize that the space that we create, the cultural space, is reflected in the political space. And when we create a materialistic culture where we worship the mighty dollar over anything else, then we should be prepared for the consequences. And one of those consequences is the apathy which is now allowing the extremists of the world to push those buttons of anger and alienation and despair, while the do-gooder elites are recycling politically correct platitudes as demonstrations of virtue, completely out of touch with the reality of suffering in the world. Just to end, as an example, I speak about my experience at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I'm sure after they read what I have to say, I will not be invited ever again. And I speak about, the billionaire bosses, the political masters, the Hollywood celebrities, and Angelina Jolie was there, and all the cameras were following her, and there was Bono and Bill Clinton, and there was like the ultimate schmooze fest of the world. So it was a bit like speed dating on steroids for corporate lobbyists and social climbers. So here's Davos, and everyone is saying the right thing. Everyone has some sexy slogan, some amazing concept, but no one is asking about challenging the order that allows a fraction of humanity to amass obscene amounts of wealth. According to the recent Oxfam report, the richest 8 people in the world have as much money as the bottom 50% of humanity. 3.5 billion people have less resources than the richest 8 people in the world. That's not going to end well. And you don't need to be a Nobel Prize-winning economist to figure that out. You could just be a silly law professor and figure it out. So I go from there to an image, and I want you to sort of think about this image. There's Angelina Jolie. Magazines are writing about her beautiful 2-piece designer outfit. And there's another celebrity with a $30,000 Hermes Birkin bag, and there's a red carpet, and there are cameras, and everyone has this, beautiful Hollywood smile with these like unbearably white teeth. So the whole thing is an incredibly glamorous affair. What is the event about? It's about the victims of rape in the Congo. It's the Global Summit on Victims of Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict that was held in London in 2015. And the article in the Daily Mail speaks about how British Prime Minister David Cameron, Foreign Secretary William Hague are competing to fawn over Angelina and the other celebrities, while talking about all these thousands of girls that have been raped in Ituri and the other conflict zones within the Congo. And I think you would agree with me that there is some profound disconnect there between what the reality is and what these group of people in a world away in London are talking about. But what's the worst thing about it is that while this event cost £5 million to organize, almost nothing went to the NGOs that are actually helping those poor girls in Ituri who are the victims of rape. They were completely starved of resources. There was no follow-up. There was no plan of action. There was nothing. It was a big spectacle which confused superficial sentimentality with genuine empathy and meaningful engagement. Even worse, it was a branding exercise. It was image building through exploiting the suffering of others. So, just to bring this to a conclusion, I think we need to have a brutally honest conversation about what it means to build a better world, what it means to connect emotionally with the reality of suffering. And in a postmodern consumer culture of unprecedented prosperity, where everyone is somehow sinking into despair with a pandemic of stress, anxiety, and depression, I think we need to understand that by helping others, we're retrieving our own authenticity. We're nobody's savior except our own. And I end with one story which I think brings home the fact that we can begin to build a better world in our own backyard in very simple ways. And that's the story of Chief Donovan Fontaine in Winnipeg, who in 2011, I believe it was, when Prime Minister Harper issued an apology for the residential schools, hears a knock at his door, and he opens the door, and he sees standing there his next-door neighbors, an elderly immigrant couple with a plate of muffins. And they said, "We saw on the news what your people have gone through, and we just want to tell you that we're sorry." And that meant so much to this chief, who's a very sophisticated politician. And just a few days ago in Winnipeg, during my book talk, I attended a hearing of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And I was shocked to see what happens right here in our own backyard, never mind halfway across the world. And it happens because we allow it to happen. Because it's not an issue. No one's going to lose a vote for it. So the point that I'm making here in what I hope will be the objective of this tour, which is to make people realize the power of their own empathy, the fundamental importance of our own decision to become engaged in whatever way we can, because there is no one-size-fits-all formula for helping make a better world.